You're watching World Talks on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. From drone strikes to railway blasts, Ukraine is ramping up its attacks on key Russian infrastructure used by Moscow to wage its war on Kyiv. It comes as the diplomatic dance continues, with leaders in Brussels last month delaying a decision on using frozen Russian funds to aid the war-torn country. And US President Donald Trump now says he's not considering deploying Tomahawks for now. Joining me in the studio to break it all down is Tom Keatinge, Director of the Centre for Finance and Security at the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you for coming into the studio. We've seen a surge in arsons, train derailments, drone attacks on refineries deep into Russian territory. Is Ukraine kind of playing Russia in its own sabotage game?
Yeah, look, I think we all know that energy is key to Russia's survival, put very simply, whether it's selling its energy to raise money internationally or whether it is kind of keeping the lights on at home, powering its military. So I think frankly what the Ukrainians are doing is something that we as the West should have been helping them do a long time ago with longer range missiles, and doing their best to take out that infrastructure as best they can.
Do these types of attacks have an impact on Vladimir Putin? Are they effective? Does he care about the fact that these refineries, for example, are being hit?
Look, energy is at the heart of the Russian economy, and as I say, if he cannot produce the oil to export to raise money, he cares about that. If he cannot produce the gas to power his tanks, he cares about that. So fundamentally, yes, I mean, it's his Achilles heel. Russia does not function without energy, and so the Ukrainians are absolutely right to go after it as best they can.
So when people say Vladimir Putin only understands force, this is definitely a force he understands.
It is. I mean, as I say, we in the West should have provided longer range missiles a long time ago. Looks like the Tomahawks aren't going to be forthcoming from the Americans anytime soon. A key contribution the Americans have made, though, in the last couple of weeks is to put sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft. That's kind of
took some time, though, didn't it?
Yeah, look, those are the first sanctions that Donald Trump has brought forward since he was inaugurated in January. But at the end of the day, it's kind of the sanctions equivalent of the Tomahawk, which is going after Lukoil and Rosneft and making the rest of the world think twice as to whether or not they should be buying Russian oil any longer.
Donald Trump saying, look, no Tomahawks for now. I mean, is that a big blow for Kyiv?
Well, I mean, it's a disappointment. It's a disappointment. But we know that, Donald Trump goes up and down like a yo-yo in terms of his attitude. Currently, I think if you'd said to Kyiv, no Tomahawks, but the Americans will sanction Lukoil and Rosneft, they'd have probably taken that. Now, of course, they want the Tomahawks, just as they wanted the F-16s. And I think they're pretty savvy, the Ukrainians now. They've figured out how to work with Donald Trump, shall we say. So I think it's a matter of when, not if.
What is the hold-up, do you think, when it comes to the Tomahawks? Sort of in Donald Trump's orbit or in Donald Trump's mind?
Look, I think Donald Trump fundamentally has a problem with providing assistance to anyone, anywhere in the world, with a few exceptions. But basically, one of the first things that Donald Trump did when he came into the White House was to close down USAID, the #1 assistance provider globally for malnourished children and so on. So at the end of the day, giving anybody to anything, whether it's Tomahawks or whether it's malaria tablets, is a problem for him. And I think he wants to keep his leverage over Ukraine. He wants Ukraine basically be dependent on begging Uncle Don for help, and this is just the latest round of that game.
Is there an element of Vladimir Putin being in his ear too?
Well, Donald Trump tends to act on the last person he spoke to, right? So he spoke to Vladimir Putin, we're all going to get together, kumbaya in Budapest. Suddenly the wrong letter got sent, that got cancelled. The next thing is he's sanctioning Russian oil assets. So I think the Europeans have figured that out as well. They're obviously quick to travel. Indeed, the Prime Minister of Poland is one such person who I think has figured out how to interact, shall we say, with Donald Trump and to make those trips to Washington and to ensure that the last person Donald Trump has heard from this week is someone from Europe or someone from Ukraine, not the Kremlin.
Speaking of Poland, you're here in Warsaw to look into what many are calling kind of Russia's hybrid war, the threats not just on the eastern flank but across Europe. What are some of the things that you're discovering, particularly around how sabotage is financed?
Yeah, so, I think you've experienced it here in Poland very much. We've experienced it in the UK and basically all countries in between Warsaw and London. And the bottom line is that the Russians have a long-standing playbook on sabotage from the Cold War times. What's interesting nowadays is that it's not necessarily the GRU agents. We had the famous poisonings in Salisbury, my hometown in the UK, of Sergei Skripal. That was GRU agents. Now, what's happening is people are being recruited online for a few $100s to throw a Molotov cocktail or to take photos of an air base and so on, or indeed to conduct arson as you experienced here in Poland. And so what we're really trying to understand is how are these people being incentivized to conduct these attacks? And of course, money, and in particular cryptocurrency, Bitcoin and so on, is at the heart of this. So this is what we're here to learn about during our visit.
Well, that was going to be my next question. How are they being paid? Because I assume that if you're conducting some kind of sabotage activity and you want to get money from Moscow, you probably can't just do that through a bank, let's say in Poland or indeed in the EU.
No, it's another of the great benefits of cryptocurrency, which is that you can make payments across borders without anybody actually being aware of that. So there's some really good reporting, both here in Poland but also in the Baltic states, looking at how this works. And so you might be on Telegram, you might be, I don't know, shopping for weed, and when you get to check out, someone says, oh, you don't need to pay us $500. You can actually earn that $500 by conducting some kind of sabotage attack. So cryptocurrency has allowed the GRU and others to essentially pay people anonymously across borders, and we are seeing more and more of that kind of there's an academic in the UK who calls it like the gig economy. So people who are just chancers, happy-go-lucky, need some money, and they'll do whatever's necessary to earn that money.
So you're saying there's suggestions that someone might be, like you say, shopping online, and just as we would get a drop-down menu of some sorts of different ways that we could get it shipped or something, or pay, one of those options on certain platforms might be, hey, do this for us, and actually you get it for free.
Yeah, look, it's not quite that simple, but essentially that's what it boils down to. I want something, I'm prepared to provide my service in return for what I want, in this case weed, and yeah, that service, it could be one of these attacks.
So talk to me about the incentive. You mentioned it's kind of go lucky. So we're not talking about people here that are necessarily pro-Russian.
No, and this is what I think makes it very difficult to identify them. And we have to go back to the fact that, of course, when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine occurred, a lot of the infrastructure of Russia got expelled. So we expelled diplomats, we expelled, GRU, spies, whatever. They got expelled. So basically what the Russians need to do is to find people who can replace the capacity that's been expelled. And what they want is to sow trouble, to sow confusion, discontent and so on. They're not looking for complex operations, they're looking for people to burn down a warehouse and that kind of stuff. And so people who are skint, need money, are susceptible to this kind of request. They might not even know who they're doing it for, but at the end of the day it's money and it pays for whatever they want.
So beyond then, I guess, the research, what action needs to follow? Because clearly this is an issue that would need to be tackled sooner rather than later. And how do you tackle something like this?
Yeah, so the EU has an internal security strategy which talks about the threat from sabotage, but it mainly talks about how weak the institutions of the EU are in responding to this. So, for example, Europol does not have responding to sabotage in its mandate. What we need to do is to remember that in pretty much every EU country, certainly here in Poland, sabotage attacks are terrorist attacks. And so if this was an attack by Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or some far-right group, then we would know what tools to use. We would know that we can freeze bank accounts, we can seize money, we can investigate and use finance as a tool of intelligence and investigation. That's what we should be doing. And that's really what is not happening across the EU right now, and that's what we're here to learn about this week.
Is Russia already at war with the West?
Russia is already at war with the West, unquestionably, and in some ways our weakness is that we don't recognise that. So when it comes to things like sanctions, we have been very timid on sanctions. We've done some strong things, but we've generally been timid because we do not recognise that we are at economic war with Russia. Russia recognises that, and that's why it's always one step ahead.
Is there a fear, very briefly, but is there a fear among leaders of taking that step to say we're at war?
Yeah, there absolutely seems to be. I mean, here in Poland, again, you have a Prime Minister who is willing to speak up very actively on this. And fundamentally, we need to recognise this because, as I think was said recently, this is not going to end anytime soon. This has got 2, 3, 4, we don't know how many more years to go. It'll end sooner when we realise that the threat is real and we don't kid ourselves.
Tom Keatinge, Director at the Royal United Services Institute, thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of World Talks. Do stay with us here on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. Good night.